Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez spent 8 years avoiding Ben Shapiro, but when she finally stepped onto the debate stage, she endured a brutal 90-minute masterclass that completely dismantled her entire political identity. Just like catcalling, I don't owe a response to unsolicited requests from men with bad intentions. That was August 2018. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had just won a primary that shocked the country. A 28-year-old bartender from the Bronx, unseating a 1-0 term incumbent who chaired the Democratic caucus. Ben Shapiro was a podcast host with an audience of millions and an offer, "Debate me, and I'll donate $10,000 to your campaign." She said no. She said it on Twitter with a line that went viral, and then she moved on. For 8 years, the debate lived in the imagination of American politics. The fight that never happened. The matchup everyone argued about, but nobody saw. The intellectual collision that both sides claimed their champion would win. It became folklore, a hypothetical with its own Wikipedia section. Then, in the spring of 2026, she said yes. The venue was the Georgetown University Gaston Hall, 1,200 seats, a moderator from the Kennedy School, and a format that gave each participant 4 minutes of uninterrupted time per segment, followed by 2 minutes of cross-examination. The tickets were free and gone in 11 minutes. The live stream would peak at 4.2 million concurrent viewers, which was more than most cable news programs drew in an entire evening. The moderator would later describe the event as the longest 90 minutes of his academic career. AOC's communications director would describe it with a single word she texted to a colleague during the third segment: ambulance. The first 5 minutes belonged to AOC. She was good at this. At the opening, at the framing, at the part of a debate where you set the terms and establish the moral high ground before your opponent can define the terrain. She spoke about inequality, about working families, about a system that rewarded wealth and punished labor. She was specific enough to sound credible and emotional enough to sound authentic, and the combination was potent. The left side of Gaston Hall applauded twice during her opening statement. A Georgetown student in the third row wiped her eyes. Shapiro listened. He sat very still. Not with the theatrical stillness of a man performing patience, but with the focused stillness of a surgeon reviewing an X-ray before the first incision. He had a legal pad in front of him, and during AOC's 4 minutes, he wrote 3 words on it. Just 3. They were not visible to anyone but him. When his turn came, he did not begin with a statement. He began with a question. "Congresswoman, thank you for that opening. I want to start with something foundational, because I think it's important that the audience understands exactly what we are debating before we debate it. You identify as a democratic socialist. You've said so publicly, repeatedly, proudly. It's on your campaign website. It's in your caucus affiliation. It's central to your political identity. So my first question is simple. Define it." AOC tilted her head, a gesture that on camera read as both engagement and mild amusement. "Not a slogan," Shapiro continued. "Not Medicare for all. Not housing is a human right. Those are policy proposals. I'm asking about the system. What is democratic socialism? How does it differ structurally from capitalism? How does it differ from socialism? Where does private ownership end and collective ownership begin? What industries would be nationalized under your framework and which would remain private? Because in 8 years of public advocacy, I haven't heard you answer that question with specificity, and I think the 1,200 people in this room and the millions watching deserve specificity before anyone hands you more power." AOC leaned into her microphone. she had the answer ready. She'd been answering this question in some form since 2018, and the answer had gotten better. With each iteration, democratic socialism means that in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, no one should lose their life because they were too poor to afford a doctor. No one should work 2 full-time jobs and still not be able to make rent. No child should go hungry because their parents' wages haven't kept up with the cost of living. That's not radical. That is basic human decency. And every other developed nation on Earth has figured this out. We're the only ones who haven't too. And the reason we haven't is not because we can. It's because a very small number of very wealthy people have decided that other people's suffering is an acceptable price for their profit. Applause. Real, sustained. The kind that comes from an audience that just heard something they believe, said better than they could say it themselves. It was an emotional home run, and AOC knew it. She sat back with the controlled satisfaction of a hitter who has just watched the ball clear the fence. Shapiro did not wait for the applause to finish. He spoke into it. Not over it, but through it, the way a surgeon speaks through the noise of a monitor because the operation doesn't pause for ambient sound. Congresswoman, that's an assertion, not an argument. The applause faded unevenly, as if the room couldn't decide whether to keep going or start listening. You described outcomes you want. I want those outcomes too. Nobody in this room wants people to pass away because they can afford a doctor. That's not a controversial position. That's a universal value. But wanting an outcome is not a system. You didn't define democratic socialism. You described a world you'd like to live in. Those are different things. A system has structures, incentives, trade-offs, and costs. You offered none of those. You offered a moral vision, and moral visions are beautiful, but they not governance. He picked up his pad. You said every other developed nation has figured it out. Which one is your model? Sweden? Sweden has no minimum wage, lower corporate tax rates than the United States, a universal school voucher system, and a private health care option that roughly 12% of the population uses. Is that your model? Would you support eliminating the minimum wage and lowering corporate taxes? Because that's what Sweden does. Denmark? Denmark's Prime Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen stood at the Kennedy School, 4 buildings from where we're sitting, and explicitly asked American politicians to stop calling his country socialist. His words, Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. Canada has universal health care. It also has wait times that average 26 weeks for specialist treatment. 26 weeks, Congresswoman. If you tore your ACL in Toronto, you'd wait 6 months for surgery. Is that the system you re-proposing? He set the pad down. So when you say democratic socialism, which version are you advocating? Because the countries you cite aren't socialist. They remarket economies with larger social safety nets, funded by broad-based taxation that falls on the middle class, not just the rich. And if that's what you want, a market economy with a larger safety net, that's a legitimate position. It's a position I'd argue against, but it's a real position with real trade-offs we could discuss. But you don't say that. You say democratic socialism. Because capitalism with higher taxes on everyone, including the middle class, doesn't fit on a dress. The right side of Gaston Hall erupted. The left side was quiet. Not hostile, not angry, but the particular quiet of people who have just heard their own position described with a precision they weren't expecting and aren't sure they welcome. Precision in political discourse is a double-edged instrument. It clarifies, but it also strips away the comfortable ambiguity that allows different people to believe different things about the same slogan. AOC started to respond. The moderator could see her leaning forward, gathering momentum. But the format's timer had expired. Her rebuttal would have to wait for cross-examination, and by then, Shapiro would have moved to the next incision. In the audience, a Georgetown political science professor turned to his colleague and whispered something that the colleague would later quote in an op-ed. "He's not debating her. He's operating on her. And she doesn't have anesthesia." The communications director in AOC's section checked her phone. The pre-drafted tweet, "AOC schools Ben Shapiro on what democratic socialism actually means," sat in the drafts folder. She did not post it. She would not post it for the rest of the evening. Some tweets remain in drafts. This one was already cold. The moderator transitioned to domestic policy. Housing. AOC's strongest terrain. The district she represented. The city she lived in. The crisis she could describe with the authority of personal proximity. "Congresswoman, you've been a vocal advocate for rent control and expanded public housing. Can you walk us through how these policies would address the current housing affordability crisis?" AOC's answer was detailed, impassioned, and grounded in the specific geography of her district. The rising rents in Astoria. The gentrification pressure in Jackson Heights. The families doubling and tripling up in apartments designed for four. She cited numbers. She cited names. She made the crisis real in a way that data alone cannot. When she finished, Shapiro responded in 7 seconds. "Congresswoman, you support rent control. Every major economics department in the country, left, right, center, agrees that rent control reduces the supply of rental housing. Paul Krugman, who agrees with you on almost everything else, has called rent control one of the best understood issues in economics. The Brookings Institution, which is not a conservative organization, published research showing that rent control in San Francisco led to a 15% decline in rental housing supply within a decade. Landlords converted to condos, withdrew units from the market, or stopped maintaining buildings. So here's the logical problem. You want more affordable housing. You support a policy that every credible economist says reduces the supply of housing. Reduced supply with constant or increasing demand produces what? Higher prices? Not lower? The policy you advocate for achieves the opposite of the outcome you say you want. That's not a math problem. It's a logic problem. You're advocating for a policy whose mechanism contradicts its stated goal. AOC fired back, fast, sharp, the Bronx edge in her voice. The Economics 101 argument against rent control ignores what actually happens to real families without it. Without rent stabilization, landlords will price out every working family in the Bronx and in Queens. You can cite Brookings all day long. My constituents aren't living in a Brookings paper. They're reliving in apartments where the rent goes up $300 every year, while their wages go up nothing. Economic theory is wonderful in a textbook. My constituents live in the real world. Applause from the left. It was a strong rebuttal, the kind that sounds like common sense and feels like solidarity. Shapiro's response came in under 3 seconds. "Congresswoman, that's an assertion, not an argument. You said economic theory is wonderful in a textbook, but your constituents live in the real world." I agree. They do live in the real world, and the real world is where rent control was implemented in your city. In New York, where it's been in place for decades, and where, in the real world, housing supply has declined, uncontrolled rents have increased, and the affordable housing shortage has gotten worse, not despite rent control, but partly because of it. He leaned forward. The real world is your evidence, Congresswoman, not mine. The real world agrees with the textbook, and when both the textbook and the real world are telling you the same thing, when the theory and the data and the lived experience of your own city all point in the same direction, and you still advocate for the opposite, that's not compassion. Compassion requires that the policy actually helps the people you claim to care about. A policy that makes you feel compassionate while making their lives worse is not compassion. It's self-medication. AOC came back immediately. She was faster than most opponents Shapiro faced. And the speed of the exchange was creating a rhythm that the audience could feel, like the tempo of a match, accelerating. Self-medication? You're accusing me of advocating for rent control because it makes me feel good? I advocate for rent control because without it, Maria Gonzalez on 82nd Street, who has lived in her apartment for 31 years and raised 3 children there, would be priced out of her home within 6 months. That's not a textbook, Mr. Shapiro. That's a human being. Congresswoman, I have no doubt that Maria Gonzalez is real, and that her situation is real. But here's what you're not telling her. The rent control that protects her apartment is the same policy that prevents her landlord from investing in new construction. The same policy that discourages developers from building the additional units that would increase supply and bring rents down for the next Maria Gonzalez. The one who doesn't have rent control. The one who's looking for an affordable apartment in Queens right now, and can it find one because rent control has reduced the available inventory by 15%. You re-protecting Maria, and you re-hurting every Maria who comes after her. That's the trade-off. And a trade-off you refuse to acknowledge is a trade-off your constituents pay for without their knowledge or consent. He glanced at his legal pad, not to read from it, but to mark something, a single check mark. Moving on. Congresswoman, that is the second time tonight I've identified a policy you support whose mechanism contradicts its stated goal. The first was democratic socialism. The second is rent control. The pattern is the same. The emotion is right, and the logic is wrong. And when you govern based on emotion instead of logic, the people who suffer are the people you retrying to help. The moderator interjected to move the debate forward. Shapiro yielded immediately. He was the kind of debater who didn't need extra time, because he said in 30 seconds what other people said in 3 minutes. The compression was the weapon. Every exchange was a scalpel cut, small, precise, and accumulating. The moderator introduced the third segment: identity, representation, and the role of lived experience in policymaking. It was framed as a broad, abstract question about whether personal background should inform legislative priorities. Shapiro made it specific within 15 seconds. Congresswoman, you frequently frame policy debates in terms of privilege and systemic power structures. You've described yourself as part of a movement that challenges the concentration of privilege in American society. I think that as a legitimate framework. I disagree with how you apply it, but the framework itself is coherent. So I want to do something that might be uncomfortable. I want to apply your framework to your own biography, not to critique you, but to test whether the framework holds when it's pointed inward. AOC's expression sharpened. She had been anticipating this since the debate was announced. Her staff had prepared for it. She had rehearsed responses. But anticipating a blow and absorbing it are different skills, and the difference becomes apparent only when the blow arrives. You attended Boston University. Current tuition approximately $65,000 per year. That's an excellent school, a school that provides genuine opportunity. You graduated with a double major in economics and international relations, which is a rigorous curriculum and a real achievement. You interned for Senator Ted Kennedy, one of the most powerful members of the United States Senate in the modern era. That internship provided access to a political network that most Americans, most people in your own district, could not dream of accessing. You grew up primarily in Yorktown Heights, Westchester County. Yorktown Heights has a median household income of approximately $100,000, nearly double the national average. The school district is rated among the best in New York State. The neighborhood is safe, suburban, and overwhelmingly middle to upper middle class. You were born in the Bronx. That is true. Your family moved to Yorktown Heights when you were 5. You've described yourself consistently as a girl from the Bronx who worked as a bartender. Both things are true. You were born in the Bronx, and you did work as a bartender. But you worked as a bartender after graduating from a $65,000 a year university with a double major, after growing up in one of the wealthiest counties in New York, and after interning for a United States senator. I want to be very clear about what I am saying and what I am not saying. I am not saying your struggles weren't real. Your father passed away when you were in college. That's devastating. Your mother worked multiple jobs. That's real. The economic pressure you experienced after your father's passing was genuine. I'm not dismissing any of that. What I'm saying is that the narrative you've constructed working-class Bronx girl who pulled herself up against a rigged system is selective. It emphasizes the parts that match your political brand and omits the parts that complicate it. And when you build an entire political identity on the claim of authenticity, when your argument for why you should lead is, I understand your life because I've lived it, the completeness of that story matters. He paused. One of the few pauses he had taken all evening. The pause was deliberate. What came next was the sharpest line of the round. Congresswoman, you use the language of systemic oppression while having benefited from systems of privilege that most of your actual constituents, the ones who live in the Bronx right now, today, who didn't attend a $65,000 a year university, who don't have Ted Kennedy on their resume, who are still bartending not as a post-college gap year, but as a career that pays their rent and their mother's insulin never had access to. I'm not calling that hypocrisy. Hypocrisy requires deliberate deception. And I don't think you're being deliberate. I think you genuinely believe the narrative you've constructed. I think you've told it so many times that it's become indistinguishable from memory. But the narrative has gaps. And when your entire political project is built on authenticity, when the brand is the biography, gaps in the biography are structural failures in the brand. AOC responded with the most personal moment of the debate. Her voice dropped. The performative edge, the cadence she used in committee hearings and Instagram lives, the one that projected outrage and moral clarity, receded. What replaced it was something raw, something that sounded less like a politician and more like a daughter. My mother cleaned houses, other people's houses. She scrubbed other families' bathrooms so that her children could have a chance. My father built a small architecture firm from nothing. From nothing. And he passed away before he could see what his work made possible. I waited tables. I made drinks. I lived in an apartment with a roommate in a walk-up in the Bronx because I couldn't afford to live alone on a bartender's salary in the city I grew up next to. She looked directly at Shapiro. Her eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible. You don't get to sit in that chair and tell me what my experience was. You don't get to reduce my mother's sacrifice to a data point about Westchester County's median income, and frankly, the idea that growing up middle class disqualifies someone from fighting for working people is exactly the kind of gatekeeping that keeps real change from happening. Frederick Douglass was self-educated. Does that mean college graduates can fight for literacy? FDR was born into extraordinary wealth. Does that make the New Deal inauthentic? This argument is beneath you, and I think you know it. The audience murmured. She had landed something real. The FDR comparison was historically effective. The emotion was genuine, not performed. For a moment, maybe 15 seconds, the room belonged to her. Shapiro waited for the murmur to settle. Then, "Congresswoman, I'm not gatekeeping. I'm fact-checking." The word fact-checking landed cleanly because it reframed the entire exchange. She was telling a story. He was checking whether the story was accurate. "You said you grew up in the Bronx. You grew up in Yorktown Heights. You moved when you were 5. Both things are true. But when you stand on a debate stage in front of millions of people and say, 'I'm from the Bronx,' you are choosing which truth to lead with. And in politics, in any form of public persuasion, which truth you choose to lead with tells your audience who you think they need you to be." FDR never pretended to be poor. He ran as a wealthy man who understood that wealth came with obligations. He was transparent about his background. That's what made his advocacy credible. He wasn't performing working-class identity. He was a rich man who chose to use his privilege on behalf of people who didn't have it. That is leadership. You're not doing that. You're selecting the elements of your biography that match your brand and suppressing the elements that complicate it. That's not authenticity, Congresswoman. That's curation. And curation is fine for Instagram, but it's not a foundation for governance. The fourth segment was where the debate shifted from combative to something else, something less like a fight and more like a diagnosis. A surgeon doesn't fight the patient. A surgeon identifies the condition, describes it precisely, and explains what happens if it's not addressed. Shapiro's tone didn't soften exactly, but it narrowed. He was no longer sparring. He was isolating a pathology. "Congresswoman, you have one of the largest social media followings of any elected official in America. Your Instagram stories get more views than most legislation gets co-sponsors. A single tweet from you can generate 10 million impressions before lunch. Your clip from a committee hearing can get more views in a day than C-SPAN gets in a month. And I want to acknowledge that, because it's genuinely remarkable. Most politicians would trade their voting records for your engagement metrics. It's a talent, and it is a real one. But here's what I've noticed, and I suspect the country is starting to notice too. There are two currencies in modern politics. The first is attention. The second is legislation. You, Congresswoman, are the wealthiest person in the attention economy and one of the poorest in the legislation economy. Those two facts are not coincidental. They are causally related. He set his legal pad flat on the table. The skills that generate attention: outrage, brevity, moral clarity, emotional resonance, the viral clip, the devastating clapback, are the opposite of the skills that generate legislation. Legislation requires compromise, which doesn't go viral; specificity, which bores people; patience, which nobody tweets about; coalition building, which means sitting in a room with people you disagree with and finding the 3 things you agree on and writing a bill about those 3 things and letting the other 97 things go. That's ugly. That's boring. Nobody makes an Instagram reel about it, but it's how laws get made. You've optimized for the wrong currency, Congresswoman. You've built a brand that generates followers, donations, and magazine covers. Your constituents don't need followers. They don't need magazine covers. They need laws. They need someone who will do the boring, ugly, unsexy work that changes their rent or their health care or their child's school. And that work happens in committee markups and whip counts and amendment negotiations, not on Instagram. AOC's response was sharp. She had been waiting for this line of critique, and she was ready. "I have introduced dozens of pieces of legislation. I've worked on the bipartisan stock trading ban with Chip Roy, a Republican. I've worked on legislation to hold the Supreme Court accountable. I've organized coalitions. I've done the committee work. The media covers the tweets, because tweets get clicks. But the work happens behind the scenes, and you're reconfusing coverage with output. You're measuring my career by what goes viral instead of what goes into the congressional record. It was her best defensive moment of the debate. Specific, substantive, and delivered with the controlled frustration of someone who is tired of being underestimated. Shapiro nodded. That's fair. You've done committee work. You've co-sponsored bills. You've participated in the legislative process. I'll grant all of that. And I mean it. Participation is real work. But the measure of a legislator is not participation. It's production. You are not evaluated by how many committee meetings you attend. You are evaluated by what becomes law because of your effort. And after 8 years, 8 years, Congresswoman, I need you to name the law. The law that exists because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wrote it, championed it, built a coalition around it, negotiated the compromises, whipped the votes, and got it to the president's desk. Silence. Tax the rich is a slogan. A bill that taxes the rich with brackets and rates and revenue projections and a CBO score and 218 votes in the House and 60 inches the Senate is legislation. You have the slogan. You've had it for 8 years. Whereas the bill. Abolish ICE is a slogan. A bill that restructures immigration enforcement with a transition plan and a budget and an implementation timeline and enough co-sponsors to survive a committee vote is legislation. Whereas the bill. The Green New Deal is a resolution. Resolutions don't become law. They become talking points. Whereas the bill that implements even one provision of it. He let each question land separately, the way a surgeon places stitches one at a time, each in precisely the right location. 8 years. 0 landmark legislation. 30 million followers. And a question that none of those followers can answer. What has Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez built? The room absorbed the question. The way soil absorbs rain after a long drought. Slowly, completely, with a faint sound that was less than silence, but more than nothing. It was the sound of 1,200 people arriving simultaneously at the same thought. They had been watching the most famous legislator in America for 8 years, and they could not name the law, not because the law didn't exist. Perhaps it did. Buried in an omnibus bill, incorporated as an amendment, attributed to a committee rather than an individual, perhaps, but the fact that 1,200 politically engaged people in a Georgetown auditorium could not name it was itself the answer to Shapiro's question. Legislation that no one can name is legislation that hasn't changed the conversation. And changing the conversation was supposed to be AOC's greatest skill. The moderator announced the final segment. 5 minutes each. Closing statements. AOC went first. She spoke about the future, about a generation that refused to accept the status quo, about the moral obligation to dream bigger than the budget allowed, about the young people watching at home who needed to know that their anger was valid and their hope was not naive. It was, by any measure, a powerful closing. She received a standing ovation from a third of the hall. Then Shapiro stood. He rarely stood during debates. He preferred the seated position, the desk, the legal pad. But for this, he stood. Congresswoman, I want to end with something honest. Not a debate point, not a logical deconstruction, something honest. You are extraordinarily talented. I've said that publicly on my show multiple times, and I mean it every time. You can communicate in a way that most people in public life would sacrifice enormously to replicate. You make people feel things. You make people feel seen and heard and represented. That's not a small thing in a democracy. That might be the most important thing. But talent without discipline produces slogans, not solutions. Communication without substance produces followers, not legislation. And at some point, and I say this not as your opponent, but as someone who has watched your career with genuine interest, the country is going to ask you a question that no amount of engagement metrics can answer. What have you actually built? Not what have you said, not what have you tweeted, not what have you worn to a party, not what have you proposed in a resolution that received 0 votes. What have you built? What law exists because of you? What system changed because you sat in a room and did the hard, boring, unglamorous work of writing legislation and building a coalition and whipping votes and accepting amendments you didn't love in exchange for a bill that actually passed? He paused. The hall was very quiet. In 2018, you compared my debate invitation to catcalling. I understood why you said it. It was politically effective. It energized your base. It avoided a confrontation that had no upside for you at the time. I'm not offended by it. I wasn't offended then. And I'm not offended now. But I hope tonight has demonstrated something. A debate is not intimidation. A debate is not catcalling. A debate is a stress test for ideas. Every idea that aspires to become law should survive a stress test. It should survive questioning. It should survive someone saying, "But how will it work? And what will it cost? And what happens when the mechanism contradicts the intention?" Ideas that survive those questions become good laws. Ideas that don't survive them, that retreat into emotion when challenged on specifics, that sound beautiful in a tweet and fall apart in a cross-examination, those ideas should not become law. Because laws affect real people, your constituents, my listeners, 330 million Americans who deserve to know that the policies proposed on their behalf have been tested by something more demanding than an applause line. He picked up his legal pad, tucked it under his arm, and looked at AOC. Not with animosity, not with triumph, but with the particular expression of someone who has just completed a procedure and is assessing whether it was sufficient. That is all a debate is, Congresswoman, a stress test, and I'm glad you finally took one. AOC stood, shook the moderator's hand, and walked off stage without stopping at the post-debate reception. Her communications director, who had spent the past 90 minutes alternating between composing and deleting tweet drafts, followed her with a phone that was dark-screened and a face that was not. They left through a side exit. A black car was waiting. They were gone within 3 minutes of the closing handshake. Shapiro stayed for 45 minutes. He signed books. He took photos with students, including, to the surprise of the remaining audience, several who told him they voted for AOC and disagreed with everything he'd said. He spoke to each of them, the way he'd spoken during the debate, quickly, precisely, and with a respect that somehow made the disagreement feel productive rather than hostile. He did not post on social media that evening. His team posted a single clip, the assertion, "Not an argument, supercut," and let the internet do the rest. The internet obliged. 3 clips dominated the first 48 hours. The first was, "Capitalism with more taxes doesn't fit on a dress," 9 words that compressed an entire logical argument into a single punchline. It was shared 2.3 million times across platforms in the first 24 hours, which made it briefly the most shared political clip of 2026. Conservative accounts shared it as vindication. Moderate accounts shared it as commentary. Progressive accounts shared it to rebut it. But sharing a clip to rebut it is still sharing the clip, and the algorithm does not distinguish between agreement and disagreement. It only measures velocity. The second was the assertion, "Not an argument, supercut." 4 instances, edited together in sequence, each followed by the 3-sentence dismantlement that followed. Viewed consecutively, the 4 instances created an escalating pattern. The same diagnostic tool applied to 4 different symptoms, each time revealing the same underlying condition. The third, was the closing, the cat-calling callback, and the stress test metaphor. This clip traveled differently. It was shared not by the usual partisan accounts, but by centrists, independents, and the politically disengaged. People who didn't follow political content regularly, but who recognized in Shapiro's closing something they hadn't seen in political discourse in a long time, an opponent who respected his adversary while dismantling her positions. The closing was generous, and generosity in victory is rare enough in politics that it becomes its own kind of virality. AOC's team was silent for 36 hours. No clips were posted, no tweets were issued, no statements were released. On the third day, a spokesperson released a 2-sentence comment. The Congresswoman was proud to participate in the Georgetown debate and looks forward to continuing the conversation on the policies that matter to working families. The statement said nothing, because there was nothing it could safely say. Every possible response, aggressive, conciliatory, dismissive, substantive, had been gamed out and abandoned. The progressive response revealed a fracture that the debate had not created, but had made impossible to conceal. One faction defended AOC's performance vigorously. A widely shared essay in Jacobin argued that the fetishization of logical consistency is itself a form of privilege, a luxury available to those whose lives are not defined by the systemic injustices that demand emotional urgency. The essay was well written, intellectually serious, and persuasive within its framework. It was also, inadvertently, a concession. By arguing that emotional urgency should take precedence over logical consistency, it acknowledged that the debate had been conducted on logical terms, and that on those terms, Shapiro had won. You don't argue against the rules of a game you were winning. The Nation ran an op-ed titled, "Debates Are Not Democracy," that questioned whether the formal debate structure inherently advantaged conservative argumentation styles. The piece was shared 800,000 times, primarily by people who agreed with AOC and were looking for a framework that explained their discomfort with what they had just watched. Several commentators noted that arguing the format was unfair was itself an admission about the outcome. The other faction, smaller, quieter, concentrated among the Democratic policy staffers and think tank researchers who did the invisible work of converting progressive values into legislative language, acknowledged what they had been saying in private meetings and encrypted group chats for years. A senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, writing anonymously on Substack, published a piece titled "The Substance Gap" that would be quoted in 12 subsequent articles. AOC is the most gifted political communicator of her generation, operating without a policy infrastructure capable of supporting her rhetoric. She can describe the world she wants to build more vividly than anyone in public life, but she has not built the analytical foundation, the cost models, the implementation frameworks, the mechanism designs that would transform that vision from a speech into a statute. Shapiro didn't expose a weakness she didn't know about. He exposed a weakness her own team has been trying to address for years. The piece was shared 400,000 times. AOC's office did not respond to it. The non-response was itself a response. The silence of an operation that could not find the rebuttal because the rebuttal required the very specificity that the piece said was missing. The Democratic Socialists of America held an internal call that was not recorded, but whose contents were leaked to The Intercept within hours, as internal calls in political organizations invariably are. Several members expressed concern that AOC's definition of democratic socialism, "no one should lose their life because they re-poor," had inadvertently harmed the movement. She described social democracy, one National Committee member said, "not socialism," and Shapiro caught it immediately. The distinction between socialism and social democracy is the foundational intellectual distinction of our movement, and our most prominent member couldn't articulate it under pressure. That is a problem we created, not Shapiro. The squad, Ayanna Pressley, Ilhan Omar, issued statements defending AOC's vision and courage. None of the statements challenged any specific argument Shapiro had made. The pattern was now familiar across the series. Allies defended the person and declined to defend the position. The gap between those two defenses was the space in which the damage lived. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the way AOC was covered, not by conservative media, which had always been adversarial, but by mainstream and sympathetic outlets whose relationship with her had previously been one of uncritical admiration. The shift was subtle but consistent. Reporters began asking about output, not about values or vision or feelings about the state of the country. About output. What legislation are you working on? What bill have you moved through committee? What have you built? The last question. Shapiro's question, the one that had closed the debate, appeared in 3 separate interviews within 2 weeks, asked by 3 different journalists who may or may not have been consciously echoing it. The question had escaped the debate and entered the atmosphere. It had become the thing you asked Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez after you finished asking her what she believed. A profile in New York Magazine, sympathetic, written by a journalist who had covered AOC since her first campaign and who clearly admired her, contained a paragraph that would be quoted more often than the rest of the 4,000-word article combined. The challenge Ocasio-Cortez faces is not ideological, but operational. She has defined what she is against with extraordinary clarity and genuine moral force. What remains undefined after 8 years, after hundreds of millions of social media impressions, after becoming the most recognizable freshman legislator in the history of the American Congress, is what she has done about it. The distance between those two things, between the clarity of the diagnosis and the absence of the treatment, is the gap that Shapiro identified, and that her career must now close. Policy institutes and think tanks, the institutions that typically operate in the background of political careers, providing the analytical infrastructure that legislators use to convert ideas into bills, began publishing analyses that read less like research papers and more like responses to a debate question. The Brookings Institution published a report titled From Resolution to Legislation: Implementation Pathways for Green New Deal Objectives. The Progressive Policy Institute released a framework for translating progressive values into scorable legislation. Neither report mentioned Shapiro. Both were clearly prompted by the question he had planted. What have you built? A Democratic strategist, one who had worked on 3 presidential campaigns and whose opinion carried weight within the party's donor class, told Politico what everyone in Washington was thinking, but few were willing to say publicly. She shouldn't have said yes to the debate. But the real problem isn't the debate. The real problem is that she said yes, and then couldn't answer the question, what have you built? That's not a trick question. That's the question. And after 8 years, she should have an answer. The fact that she doesn't tells us something about the last 8 years. AOC's small-dollar fundraising spiked in the 72 hours following the debate, a predictable response. The political equivalent of an immune system rallying. The base was loyal, and loyalty in the attention economy expresses itself through donations, the way loyalty in older systems expressed itself through letters and yard signs. The spike was real, it was measurable, and it would be cited by AOC's team as evidence that the debate had been a net positive. But a different metric told a different story. Institutional donor interest. The bundlers, the PAC directors, the people who write 6-figure checks and expect to influence the trajectory of a political career, continued a decline that had begun after the Kennedy hearing months earlier, and that the Shapiro debate had accelerated. 2 bundlers who had been in early-stage conversations about a 2028 exploratory committee told Axios they were reassessing the timeline. In bundler language, reassessing the timeline is the second step in a withdrawal. the first being pause, which they had already taken. The debate clip, within a week, had found its way into opposition research files maintained by at least 3 Republican campaign operations, and more damagingly, 2 Democratic ones. It sat alongside the Kennedy hearing clip. 2 different critiques by 2 different men using 2 different methods, arriving at the same conclusion, that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was the most gifted communicator and the least productive legislator of her generation, and that the gap between those 2 things was not narrowing. On her desk, alongside the yellow legal pad that had appeared after the Kennedy hearing, still in its plastic wrapping, still unused, there was now a second object, a policy brief from the Brookings Institution on rent control outcomes in major American cities. It had been printed by a legislative aide who had not been asked to print it. 3 pages were dog-eared. The margins contained notes in a handwriting that was not the aide's. At a staff meeting 3 weeks after the debate, the same cluttered district office, the same coffee mug that said Queens, the same view of Westchester Avenue through a window that hadn't been cleaned since the last election. AOC was reviewing a draft housing proposal with 3 staffers. The proposal included a rent stabilization provision. A legislative aide, 24 years old, a graduate of CUNY, hired 6 months earlier, looked at the provision and asked a question. What is the mechanism? How does this incentivize new construction instead of just capping prices on existing units? AOC looked at him. The question hung in the air, the way questions do when they arrive, at exactly the right moment, not too early to be ignored, not too late to be useful. What do the economists say about this mechanism? She asked. It was the first time in 8 years that she had asked that question before introducing a proposal, rather than after being criticized for not asking it. The aide didn't know this. He didn't know about the Kennedy hearing, or the Shapiro debate, or the yellow legal pad still in its wrapping, or the Brookings brief with the dog-eared pages. He just pulled up the research on his laptop and began reading the findings aloud. AOC listened. She listened the way she had not listened during the debate. Not for the rebuttal, not for the flaw, not for the emotional counterpoint, but for the mechanism, for the thing that made the policy work or not work in the real world, independent of how it sounded in a speech. It was a small change. Nobody in the office noticed it. Nobody outside the office would ever know it happened. But it was there, in the question she asked, in the pause before she asked it, in the way she waited for the answer instead of providing one. A stress test doesn't destroy an idea. It reveals whether the idea was ever strong enough to survive. When the performance fades and the viral clips are forgotten, what ultimately matters more in shaping a nation's future, the power to capture the world's attention or the quiet discipline to actually build something that lasts?